Ross, what is the first step or first series of steps in creating a web series?
Well, the first thing you have to work on is the basic concept. What is the basic story you're going to tell on an ongoing basis? And hopefully it's not the 9 trillionth Slacker series on among web series there, that it has some uniqueness to it there, something that's different. You should probably make sure you're writing about something that you're familiar with yourself so that you can really be authentic in the details and the language. And then once you identify the topic and the central dramatic problem of the series or what you're going to explore, you've got to populate it with characters. And I often find with my students that the biggest mistake they make with the character development is they think of characters as like a laundry list. Okay, it's in a dormitory, so there's a guy who's a jock, and there's a woman who's a cheerleader, and then there's the guy who's the nerd. And they're just as if these characters are floating independent of each other, and that's not really how it works when you're developing a series. A series has an architecture to how the characters all work together. So I try to tell the students I work with to think of it more, rather than a vertical list, as a wheel with your central character in the middle and then spokes coming out for all the other characters. How do they put new pressures on your character? How do they put pressures or conflicts on each other as well? So that, because that's where you're going to get the stories from. That's where the legs of the series, so to speak, will emanate from, is these conflicts. And so you need to develop that architecture.
What would you advise as the length of each episode?
It varies so greatly there. I mean, some people say you should never have anything longer than this many minutes, and yet House of Cards it's not a web series, but it was released over the internet and had nearly 1 hour episodes there. So my sort of stock answer for that is, when you look on the internet at video and you see the menu that has the length of each episode, what's the length beyond which you won't click yourself? If you won't click if it's more than 6 minutes, then you probably shouldn't write a web series that has episodes longer than 6 minutes, because your sensibility seems to not want to go longer than that there. But I think it's entirely possible. I just looked at one of Freddie Wong's web series, the Video High School thing. They have 30-minute episodes there. So it's really flexible, but I think you should gauge by your personal preferences.
So going back to that old adage, sort of write what you know and write what you would like, and not what you think your supposed audience wants.
Right. Yeah, I mean, guessing what the audience wants is, if people could accurately do that, they would, but you can't do that with writing songs. You can't do that with creating feature films or standard television shows on broadcast or cable networks. It's a trial and error process, and I think you're always best writing what gets you excited, what you find compelling yourself, what you think is funny or what you think is dramatic or interesting. And then hopefully there'll be enough like-minded people, if you do it well, that'll be your audience.
So how soon should one factor in conflict? Let's take a 30-minute webisode. When is there a specific marker, or there's no real science to it?
Well, in general writing theory, I think every scene should have conflict. If there isn't conflict in a scene, I'm not sure what's driving it dramatically. There are exceptions to this. I mean, you may just want to establish the atmosphere or who the character is in general. But as a rule of thumb, one of my writing mentors made us, when we were writing our outlines, say what the conflict was in every scene. And it doesn't have to be, maybe it's a person, cliche scene, waking up in the morning, but it's more interesting if they're waking up in the morning and they're late for work than if they're just waking up in the morning and drinking coffee.
Ross, what are some of the best tips for writing a web series?
Well, I think the first demand in web series is to be economical in your storytelling, and to make sure that you're telling that each word that you write in your script does something to advance the story, to entertain, to clarify who the characters are, to deepen the characters, and to use it. You've got such a limited amount of time. You should use every second you have for entertaining.
What do you advise to your students in terms of looking at other web series? Do you have them go on YouTube or Vimeo and things like that?
Absolutely, and I try to screen for them in class both examples of things that I think are very good and examples that I think are not very good, and to talk about where someone might have gone wrong, in my opinion, including showing previous student work. I had a student several years ago who had what I thought was a terrific idea for a web series. It was called Model Family, and it was narrated by a 15-year-old boy who said, I don't feel right in my family. I don't fit with my family because I grew up in a model family. I don't mean everybody's perfect. I mean everybody's a model. And then you meet his family, and his father's the brawny paper towel kind of model guy, and his mother's an underwear model, and his brother's like an Abercrombie shirtless jean model, and they're in those characters as if they come off the pages of a magazine as real human beings in the house too. And I thought it was a very clever concept for a web series. And then they went to cast it, and they had trouble. I teach at Chapman University at the Dodge College of Film and Media Arts, and we're in Orange County. So sometimes it's hard to get actors to come from LA. And they had a casting session and said, well, we really didn't get anybody good. So the student cast himself as the father. And it completely ruined the show. You didn't believe it was a real family. You have to believe, for that premise, that as bizarre as the family is, that it has some sense of reality to it.
Right, and that's what I'm curious about, is what is it that makes an audience sort of glob on to the series and the characters versus not? And I'm sure it's not a science. And
yeah, it isn't a science, it's an art there. But the characters, I think, are the main thing that when they are kind of this paradox of both fresh and relatable. If I've named any television show for you, if I said, say classic television shows, Happy Days, first thing that's going to come to your mind is the Fonz, I would bet. Or if I said All in the Family, the first thing that's going to come to your mind is Archie Bunker. Today, if you say something, Modern Family, the first thing that's going to come to someone's mind is whichever of those characters are their favorite characters. And that's what brings you back episode after episode to a series there. You relate to the characters. It's why I think Felicia Day's show, The Guild, had such a long life there, because it was about online gamers, and she had an audience of people who were online gamers themselves, so they could relate to those characters.
So going back to Model Family,
Sure.
if it had been redone and these were more, even if they weren't likable characters, but there was something in them that was more human, what do you think it was?
I think it was the casting and the direction in that particular series there. But yeah, I think the concept was a good concept there. But when you take a 22-year-old guy, even a guy with a beard, and say, hi, I'm the dad, it doesn't seem like a family to you. It seems like students play acting at that point in time. It's why I advise, whether they're my students or they're people out in the world who are making web series, that you need to find real actors to be the actors. I know we'd all like to pretend that we can act, but we all can't act. And so it's really worth the effort to go to a theater department somewhere, go to a local theater, find actors who can bring something, professionalism, to your project.
Ross, I realize we just briefly touched on this, but what is then the art of creating hit web content? I mean, how much of it can be orchestrated, let's take Freddie Wong and Brandon Latch with Video Game High School. How much of it is a combination of chance, timing, creativity?
I think it is serendipity. I certainly think there are skills to making a good web series, to having a good story, having compelling characters, even nuts and bolts things like, hey, have some decent sound and not bad sound. All of those things I think are important. But I think if you could put a formula together, Sony and everybody else in the big media world would have done that, and they can't do it. They can't do it with $200 million movies. They certainly can't do it with web series. So again, I think you have to start with something that you find entertaining yourself, and then I think you need to make sure that you're taking care with each step of the process, that you don't just get an idea and grab your camera and rush out to start filming something, that you plan out who the characters are, how will they work together, what is the general arc of your series going to be. Take time writing the pilot script. I have a lot of students they'll pitch me the story for the pilot script, and I say, well, not much is happening. And they say, well, really cool stuff happens in episode 3. And my response is always, well, no one's going to stick around and watch episode 3 unless really cool stuff happens in episode 1. And so, you've really got to grab the audience. And we've got the audience now on a web series has their trigger finger on the mouse button from the beginning, and they're almost physically predisposed to clicking their index finger every 5 seconds. So you've really got to grab their attention. But you do your best work. You make sure that you're getting real actors to play the parts, that you've got good sound, that you've thought out what you want the visual look of the series to be, that you really make it as good as you can. Even the beginning and end credits. I think one of the great examples from the feature film world of how you use every second is the movie a long time ago, Airplane. And it was a broad comedy, but they had comedy right to the very last credit of the movie. The last credit, they would put things in the credit like Best Boy, which is an assistant to one of the lighting people, and they would put the actual name of the best boy in the movie, but then the next credit would be Worst Boy, Adolf Hitler. And they would just put in things like A Tale of Two Cities, written by Charles Dickens. And so the credits became entertaining right up to the boilerplate legal thing at the end that says, this film may not be duplicated without violating Penal Code 1.32575. So there. And I thought, that's just brilliant. They made the most boring thing you can imagine, a required legal warning, into a joke in the film. So, I think that's a great example of how you do your best, give it your all in every aspect of the web series you're putting together.
Well, it almost sounds like creating a viral video is similar to choosing a stock. and there's real, you could look at all the financials, you could see who the CEO was in their prior performance, and you still don't know if this thing's going to, surpass its moving day average or whatever. So what are some of the things that you've seen people do once they see that their thing has not gone viral? Do they abandon it? Do they keep working at it?
I would hope that they keep working. Whether they do the same thing over and over again may not be the wisest thing to do, but write your next piece, right? I think creating series and writing in general, you get better at it with practice there. And a lot of the people who are writing web series are fairly early in their learning curve of being writers or filmmakers, and I really would advise them to move on to the next project. Sometimes it's tempting for young artists to feel that their idea is so precious that this is the one and only idea that's great, and I think you need to get past that and say, okay, tried it out, good learning experience, now I know how to do it better next time. I've been writing professionally for over 30 years now. I'm still learning every time I write a piece. I once read a novelist who said, every novel you write is your first novel because you haven't written that novel before. And so you have to put the time in learning and you'll get better.
So what is the time frame to try something out where they're not, because I've seen a lot of these sort of serial creative types where they come up with this great precious idea and then somehow they abandon it, and then there's various reasons why.
Yeah, there's a real tension between, you don't want to just get an idea and rush out and shoot it tomorrow and not put any planning into it. But there you can also get caught in the, I'm going to write my 900th draft of this script trap, or I'm going to do one more edit and so on. So you have to find a balance between being thoughtful and being careful and doing your best work and just trying to reach something that's unattainable, which is perfection. I give another example I give my students of the kind of care that professionals put into their work is I have a copy of an outline from the series Mad Men. It's from the 4th season. It's the first episode of the 4th season. It's written by the show's creator. So he's done the show for 3 years. He's won Emmys for Outstanding Drama 3 years in a row at that point in time. Clearly knows the show and his craft very well. At the top of the outline it says 10th draft. So that's a professional who puts that kind of care, effort, and revision into his work. So again, it's a balance. You don't want it to say 105th draft. That seems too many to me.
How many times do you have to rein your students in and say, okay guys, realize this is a grand idea, but this isn't, you don't have James Cameron behind it. So you've got to do more of a tape type of thing where it's just one room,
Yeah, well, they have a limitation, the budget for starters, but there are all kinds of ways that's your job as a professor and as someone who's been a professional to try to give them your perspective. Sometimes they'll be pitching the story idea to me, and I'll just say, you can't do that in 5 minutes. You just pitched 11 scenes, each of which is approximately a minute and a half, and that I need to give them that perspective. I make them, when they're preparing to go shoot, not only create a shot list, but create something I call a time management budget, where they cut and paste their shot list and say, okay, our call time on Saturday is 8 a.m. Between 8 a.m. and 11 a.m. we're going to do these shots here, and they're in the list. And you can see real quickly when you say, really, so let's not say 11 a.m., let's say 8 and 9 a.m., you're going to do 21 setups between 8 and 9 a.m.? I don't think so. That's not right. Or I just had this conversation yesterday with the students where I said, I think you've got something pretty ambitious here, and your project, with your pilot, they were shooting episodes now, subsequent episodes, you found that improv with the actors worked really well, so you want to make sure you leave time for that. And they had a response to this, which is, well, we think we're going to go faster because we have 2 cameras. And we've got an extra hour and a half at the end of the day that's kind of fudge time, that if we spill over into it, that's okay. So, that's part of the dialogue you engage in as a professor with the students, to make sure that they're benefiting from your experience.
So, of your students that create web series or set out to create them, what do you see as their biggest stumbling block in the beginning?
That's an interesting question. I think the biggest stumbling block for them is really understanding what kind of a concept you need to support a series, as opposed to a single or maybe 2 or 3 stories. And it doesn't come as naturally as one might think. It's elusive, because we see so many web series, we think, well, it must be easy to come up with these concepts, but it isn't. And a lot of times, my students do a total of 4 episodes, and with the concepts that don't really have legs, you can feel it by the time you're trying to develop a story for episode 3 and 4, that they're huffing and puffing trying to come up with an idea.
Interesting. So it sounds like then they come up with these grand ideas, but maybe then there's not longevity to the story?
Sometimes there's not longevity to the idea. Sometimes this is because they're younger writers or they're newer writers, and so they don't have the experience. But even among professionals, I remember hearing a quip from one of the Laverne and Shirley writers, that they were celebrating their 150th episode, and one of the writers got up and to make a toast and said, well, we've done 150 episodes, that's almost 75 different stories. So they knew they were repeating themselves on a professional television series. So it's a challenge to come up with a different story every week for your characters, or every episode.
Ross, when you decided you wanted to become a television writer before you got into teaching, how important was it to you that you achieved that goal? I mean, was that your mindset from the beginning once you left Berkeley, that you were going to?
Well, it's funny. When I was at Berkeley, I did some comedy writing in school. I actually had a sketch radio comedy program along with a childhood friend, Joel Cerno, who turned out to be one of the creators of 24 eventually. And we did sketch comedy on the radio, which is about as difficult as you can imagine, because in comedy you need to hear if the audience is laughing or not, and you don't on the radio. So it would be, you'd do something you thought was funny, and maybe the engineer would laugh, but you would just hope somebody was listening out there. And I also wrote for the humor magazine at Berkeley, which is where I went to college. But simultaneous to all this, I got a summer job through my father working for a company that made television commercials. My father was an advertising executive, and so I got a job as a gopher, a PA for a company that made McDonald's and United Airlines and Kentucky Fried Chicken commercials, and I loved it. It was hugely fun. It didn't matter how demeaning the work was. One of my first jobs, this is a true story, I stood in for a dog in a dog food commercial, on my hands and knees, face near the bowl and so on, because I was cheaper to hire me than to hire a second dog. Because if they don't want to tire out the star dog, and if you hire a second dog, you have to have a second union animal handler, and so I was cheaper than that. I think there was some good-natured hazing going on as well, because my father was an advertising executive, and I was probably the 9,000th son of an advertising executive who got a summer job, but I had a great time. So by the time I graduated from college, I was torn about whether to go pursue writing or pursue production. And frankly, I wasn't good enough to be a professional writer at that time. So it was the better path for me to pursue production and practice writing, write spec scripts and get better at them. And it hadn't even quite gotten on my radar to be a sitcom writer yet. That happened when I moved back to Los Angeles, and just in socializing found out that the older brothers and sisters of my friends some of them were getting jobs as sitcom writers. And I thought, hey, I'd like to do that. So my school for that was they showed reruns of the Mary Tyler Moore Show and the Bob Newhart Show, where he was the psychologist, in the afternoon. So when I was unemployed, I had freelance employment as a commercial production assistant at that time. When I was unemployed, I'd watch the shows in the afternoon, and I'd try to scrape up scripts from somewhere to read them. It's much easier now to at least get the resources to learn your craft. They didn't even have VHS tape machines at that time when I was starting out, so all you could do was watch TV to study something. Now, go watch 50 episodes of something on DVD or stream it or whatever, and the scripts are available on the internet.
Realize that you went to school for journalism, I guess?
Yeah.
Okay, right. So from that time when you were sort of on the couch watching those episodes, what was the time frame when you actually stepped foot in that writer's room and started making a living?
It was actually 9 years, and there was a progression along the way. I got out of college. I worked for about 6 or 8 months in San Francisco, then moved back to Los Angeles. And that's when I started writing spec scripts. And I wrote a spec movie by myself. Then I had a partner, and she and I wrote spec sitcoms. And this was simultaneous to doing commercial production. I eventually got a chance to work in a production capacity on movies and TV, and would write more spec scripts when I was unemployed, and then got into the Directors Guild as a second assistant director. And that's when I got my first almost break there, where the producer's brother of the movie I was working on was trying to help develop their television part of their production company, and his assistant learned that I had spec scripts and asked to read the spec script my partner and I had written, and said, hey, this is really good, and got it to an agent, an incredibly prestigious agent who was William Goldman's agent at the time, and Joan Didion, the agency, I don't know if it was the agent. And in hindsight, I know that the agency was just doing this powerful producer's brother a favor. They took us on as clients on a 30-day trial basis. And of course, they sent the script out to shows that said, yeah, we got writers already. This is okay. So that came and went. I kept writing. I kept working as an assistant director. And I got encouragement along the way. I was the second assistant director on a movie called National Lampoon's Vacation, the first one, where they go to fake Disneyland place there, Wally World. And Chevy Chase was the star of the movie, and learned somehow that I had written spec scripts, and was incredibly generous and said, give me one, I want to read it. So I had written a script for a show called Police Squad, which was the TV predecessor to the Naked Gun movies. And Chevy read it. I still have the script in my office now. He gave me a B+, which was pretty nice of him, and then wrote notes on it, and then signed it Mel Brooks. But at the end of it, and he said this to me personally too, he said, seriously, you have talent and you should keep doing this. And I can't tell you what that meant to me at that time, to have somebody who was a big comedy star and had been a writer himself on variety shows, including Saturday Night Live and the Smothers Brothers and so on, say, yes, keep doing this. So I had that encouragement. Also, my other break was that aside from life break, I met my wife, and her uncle was a CBS current comedy executive. And he read my spec scripts and said, these are good. And he got them to an agent, who eventually became my agent, but he read the Police Squad script and the script I'd written with my former partner, said, these are excellent. I cannot represent you because you're not writing with your partner, and Police Squad's not on TV, and there's nothing on TV like it. So write another script. I wrote a Cheers script, called him up. He read the script. I didn't hear from him for several weeks, and so I had to make that dreaded phone call where you haven't heard, so you're sure it's not going to be good news. And he took the phone call, and when I asked if he'd read the script, he said, yeah, it was really funny. And then just stopped talking. And I said, isn't that good for a comedy that it's funny? He said, yes, but it's too dirty even for Cheers. It's like an R-rated Cheers. which became a joke between us as the years went on and he represented me, because I did nothing but squeaky clean family comedies like The Cosby Show and the TGIF shows on ABC's Family Lineup, and no one thought I could write adult comedy. And I almost begged him to take this 20-year-old script out at one point in time and send it around. But it took time for me to get that good. And so when he said, you have to write another script beyond the Cheers, I wrote another Cheers. And then he made some suggestions, and I took the notes and rewrote the script a little bit. And at that point, he said, okay, I can represent you. And I don't want to continue with this story, because then he called me 2 months later. I had a job as an assistant director then. I was the first AD by that time on a show called Knots Landing, one of the nighttime soap operas. So the bills were getting paid. And then he calls me up in early September, late August of 1984, and says, I have great news. Bill Cosby is doing a new situation comedy, and they read your script and they really like it and they want to hire you, but you've got to go to New York for the job. Well, the previous year, I idolized Bill Cosby, listened to his records as a child, so this was an unbelievable offer. The previous year, though, when my wife was pregnant and we had an 8-year-old, I was out of town doing the only job I could find for 4 months. So it would have been disastrous for my marriage to leave town again. So I turned the job down. And my wife's uncle, the CBS executive, said to me, this is 2 weeks before Cosby premiered, you're better off, the show's in a terrible time slot, it's up against Magnum PI, it's probably not going to last more than 13 weeks. Well, the show came on and lasted more than 13 weeks. It was a huge hit out of the box. My wife felt horrible at this point in time, like she denied my dream in life. But it worked out. I had my day job at Knots Landing, got a freelance assignment on another sitcom called Webster, so I got a writing credit that year. And the following year, the baby wasn't so little, and The Cosby Show still was interested in hiring me, so I went and did the second season of The Cosby Show. So there's an all's well that ends well story for you.
So during this 9-year journey, and you're writing these spec scripts in your free time,
right?
Where are you finding that free time? I realize you have a family, you have obligations, you also have a job.
Well, when I was unemployed, because not so much during the Knots Landing period, it was before that. In fact, this is very funny. The Cheers script that I wrote, the first one that was too dirty, that according to the agent there, actually I got the idea for this script because I was being an absolute pain in the neck to my wife. Because I was unemployed and we just had a baby and I thought I was a failure and I wasn't supporting my family. And we're actually having an argument about this at 11 o'clock at night, where she says, you've got this free time, why don't you write something now? And she said, why don't you rewrite your feature script? I said, well, I'm not ready to do that. She said, well, then write a Cheers episode. I said, well, I would, but I haven't had any ideas. Wait, I just got an idea. It was bizarre. In the middle of an argument, I went over, my desk was in our bedroom at that time, was a table, a kitchen table that was in our bedroom, and I wrote notes and said, okay, I'll do this starting tomorrow. And I wrote the script in a week, and then called up the agent and said, okay, I've written another script. And it really got my agent interested in representing me, even though he had reservations about that particular script. He clearly said, this guy can write comedy. So that's what I did. When I was unemployed, I would write. It was too difficult to write with a family and a 12-hour-a-day job, but it was a job that had periods of unemployment, and so I tried not to be lazy during those times.
Well, speaking of which, how would you motivate yourself? Because it's so easy to have a grand plan like that, and it sounds great in theory, but then how did you actually execute it every day? What was your sort of disciplined itinerary?
I found, and this is still true for me, that I work best in the morning, and so I would get up and kind of, a lot of times what helps me is to exercise. And if I'm, either jogging in those days or now on an elliptical machine in the gym, that time and taking a shower and stuff is really productive for me to think about what I'm going to be doing that day with my writing, or to solve a writing problem I'm having, so that when I hit the desk, so to speak, I'm really hit it running, and I've got some momentum, and that worked for me. I also think I just enjoyed writing. I really wanted to achieve this goal really badly, and could see that others were achieving it. It wasn't like, I lived in Los Angeles, so I could see people around me who were breaking through, and I knew that it was possible, and so I just kept at it. But your question's a really good one, because you have to be disciplined. One of the great stories of discipline, perhaps the most disciplined writers I ever heard of was a man named Stephen Cannell, passed away a few years ago, became incredibly successful. I mean, if you could get a show on TV, you're successful. If you get multiple series on TV, that's beyond successful. Stephen Cannell created or co-created 40 television series. 4-0. That's unbelievable. He wrote or co-wrote 450 episodes of television. I mean, just think about that. I know that just sounds like a large number, but if you write 15 scripts a year that get produced for 30 years, amazing. Stephen Cannell came and spoke to my students several years ago and said, I am severely dyslexic. I flunked out of the 3rd grade. I flunked out of the 8th grade. If I can make it, you can make it. But his key was, he said, I'm not the smartest guy in the room. I'm not the most talented guy in the room. I'm the hardest working guy in the room. And when Cannell got out of college, he had a day job at his family's furniture business and then wrote from 5 p.m. to 10 p.m. every day, Monday through Friday, put in a full day writing Saturday and a half day Sunday. He did this for 6 years until he got a job. And I'll never forget him saying, but the thing is, at the end of every year, when I looked back, I was that much better. And it was just awe-inspiring to hear him talk about that. And he had to keep practicing. There's a theory in general, not just about writing, but about any kind of pursuit, that it takes 10,000 hours of practice to become an expert at something. Tennis, piano, computer programming, writing. That's a long time. That's, if you practice 20 hours a week for 50 weeks a year, that's 1,000 hours. So my 9 years probably was not too far off what that metric was for getting good at it.
Ross, I believe you wrote a blog post about how college classmates are future business contacts. And is this something that you talk to your students about on a regular basis? And maybe you can elaborate.
Absolutely. I mean, if you're in film school, look to your left, look to your right. These are the people you're going to be working with in your career. And so you want to treat your classmates well. I mean, you should do that just as a human being. But in terms of business savvy, you have to remember that they have aspirations just like you do. And so not all of them, but many of them will succeed. And they'll be gateways to help you get a job somewhere. Somebody's going to succeed before you, and then they're going to move on to their next job, and somebody's going to need to replace them. Having a good relationship with them is a good idea. I also tell my students, when you go in and have a meeting with somebody, if let's say you get a pitch meeting somewhere or an interview, whatever the situation is, be nice to the receptionist, be nice to the assistants, because they're going to be executives in a few years, and they're going to remember how you treated them when they weren't, quote, important. And so it's just been my experience. I've been around the business in one way or another for 40 years now, and I still run into people that I had interactions with when I was a production assistant or that at different phases of my career, and you can't go wrong being decent to other people.
We're in an interesting time where we're all sort of, our own PR company in some sense with social media. How do we keep up with our former classmates in a way that's collaborative without being too much of a show person?
Yeah, my colleague Neil Landau, who's also a writer and a teacher and many of the same things I am, has a really good strategy, so to speak, for this, where he calls it writing charming notes. And part of the trick of this is to not have it always be about yourself. If you see that someone that you've worked with has had a success, write them a note, an email, a Facebook post or whatever, and say, congratulations, I'm really happy for you. If every contact you have with people ends with, and here's what I want you to do for me, I don't think that's very good networking there. I think if you can genuinely feel good about your colleagues having successes there, that's building relationships over a period of time too. And I think you have to really say, and if nothing ever comes of that, fine. This is where I get a little, from my Berkeley background, into karma and so on. That if you put good vibes out there, then I think what comes around goes around.
There was a young woman who wrote for the Dodge College of Film and Media Arts site and mentioned how she had become a writer and that a lot of people had warned her ahead of time that this is a cutthroat business, and she wanted to make it more of a collaboration. She says, you're in these writers' rooms, you have to make it a collaboration. How does someone do that? How does someone thrive in a competitive situation, or maybe it's not? Maybe there's some fallacy behind that.
Look, you're going to encounter both. If you're fortunate enough to be, well, whatever you become, whether it's in the entertainment industry or in the drapery business, you're going to meet nice people, you're going to meet not nice people. You're going to meet people who are generous and collaborative, and you're going to meet people who will throw you under the bus. And I prefer the nicer version of this. When I was a showrunner, the head writer on sitcoms, I tried to create that environment in the writer's room, that we're here to help each other, not to one-up each other or anything, because you're in that room for a long time, and week after week, month after month, I think you get better creative work out of people when you do that. But not everybody behaves that way. There are some showrunners who are notoriously not nice people there. I read about one in the newspaper, I won't name names here, where the showrunner said to another writer who eventually became quite successful herself, was just screaming at her in the hallway about how bad her script was, to which she said, do you want to go into your office, or is public humiliation part of what you're going for here? Which he found funny, and then still berated her about her script. So I don't work well personally in that environment. So you try and get along with people. But I've also not been the boss in other rooms where the showrunner was tough to work for, and you have to learn how to succeed in that environment too, and how to make that work for yourself. Or if you get to a situation that's just unbearable, really hard to do when you're getting your first job, so you probably wouldn't do it there. But sometimes you have to say, life's too short, and I'm not going to work in this environment, and move away.
So since we're all humans, we all have our good days, bad days, everybody has an ego, everybody has some type of agenda, whatever it is, even if it's harmless. Let's say someone's in an environment and it's not horrible, but there's some issues. How does someone survive and they don't want to move on? Just general tips on surviving a somewhat, adversarial writer's room.
Sure. Well, let's take the writer's room example there. I think it's good to take a step back and say, holy cow, I'm getting paid to write for a living. I'm getting to do something that very few people get an opportunity to do. I'm not a coal miner. I'm not cleaning out toxic waste from gas stations. I have one of the greatest jobs in the world that I enjoy. I get paid to go be funny every day, or to write stories, or whatever type of show you're on. I think that really helps to give that kind of perspective, and to give yourself that kind of perspective. And also, I think even difficult situations are fodder for future storytelling there. That the person who's making your life miserable can come in handy when you need to write that situation in a script. I'll give you an example from not my life, but my brother-in-law's life. He worked in the radio business, still does, works at Pandora now. But he was at a traditional radio station, was a general manager of several stations in the Bay Area, and his company had gotten gobbled up by a larger media conglomerate. And the new Uber boss called all of the Bay Area station managers into a meeting and said to them, my goal is to make sure that by the time Christmas rolls around, the competition's children all have one less gift under the tree. Well, I think that's just a nightmare. I mean, I can't, that's what gets this guy's motor running, is bringing unhappiness to someone else's children. But I'm sure holding on to that as a piece of dialogue someday when I want to write that scene. So I think everything's material for you, and you'll take that as a plus. And I think you can also learn, let's say you're in a writer's room where there are people you don't get along with. I think you learn how not to behave, so that someday when you're a showrunner, you remember to not behave that way. And it's really important. One of my early jobs after Cosby was on a show called The Facts of Life. And a lovely woman named Irma Kalish was the showrunner for much of the time I was there. And she treated everybody with respect and dignity, and I learned a ton from her about how to treat people on a show. And I'm happy to say that now her grandson is one of my students at Dodge College at Chapman University. So and she's still alive. She's in her late 80s and still writing. So the point is, you can learn how to behave, or you can learn how not to behave, depending on what environment you're in.
Ross, what are the differences between being the head writer for a television show versus being one of the staff writers?
Yeah, there's a huge difference. Even when you are the number two person or persons on a writing staff, it's not the same as being the head writer. When you're the head writer on the show, you're the decision maker. You have to say, yes, that's the story we're gonna develop, or I don't think that's quite right, or all those decisions. You make 5,000 decisions a day, whether it's about a line or a joke or the word that to use in the description or a whole series arc for the season. You have to make tons and tons of decisions, and there's a lot of pressure to that. And I always want to do my absolute best work, but I remember coming home one night and saying to my wife, I had an epiphany today that it's not always about what's the best possible story for the show. Sometimes it's just what's the best story I can come up with on a Monday, or that we can come up with, that the staff can come up with. I think also when you're a staff writer rather than the showrunner, it can be frustrating. Sometimes you have different ideas from the showrunner, and you really, really know in your heart you're right, but you don't get to do it, and so you have to find a way to make peace with that. On the other hand, I found that especially my earliest jobs, Cosby was my first staff job, I learned so much from the experienced writers on the show. I mean, I was good enough to be allowed in the writing room, but they had so much more experience and had written so many more shows and were so much more facile at the work that needed to be done, and had it's almost like I had the play school toolbox for how to write, and they had the real professional 3-level toolbox of how to do it. So I think that's actually one of the joys of being a staff writer, is even though you may be frustrated they're not doing it your way, I think you should say, this is the Harvard Graduate School of Comedy Writing or Drama Writing if you're on a drama, and I'm in a room with real seasoned professionals, and this is a learning opportunity.
But it sounds like also too, being the head writer is not always what it's cracked up to be, because then you have the ones that are underneath, metaphorically, that there may be, tugging at what you want versus, what are some of the there's a room full of people. They're talented. They also all have human foibles and egos and whatever else. One of the rules I tried to set up in my writing room with the writers is, I not only think it's okay for you to disagree with me, I certainly hope you disagree with me, right up until the point where I say, okay, I've made a decision and this is what we're doing. Because at that point, I'm driving the bus and I've got to do that. And by the way, I'll be wrong a lot of the time. That's just the way it is. But we can't just keep arguing in a circle over and over again, or we won't get our work done. It's very demanding that way. The other thing that's demanding about it being a head writer is that that's not your only job. You're also in charge of the budget of the show, of looking at cuts, of this whole machinery. I think I once described the job to someone as, it's as if you were at the plate in baseball with the bat, but when the pitcher wound up, he threw 9 balls at you and you had to pick which one was the most important ball to hit at that moment. And because you have to prioritize your time, everybody needs something from you, and so you've got to learn how to juggle that. You've also got to learn how to trust your staff then. If the room can't come to a grinding halt, the writing process can't come to a grinding halt because I have to be in editing for 2 hours as part of my job. You have to empower the writers that are on your writing staff to feel comfortable moving forward and not feel like you're just going to shoot down everything they say. And of course, you don't want to just say yes just to make them feel good, but hopefully you've selected talented writers and writer producers that can be productive when you're not there. Ross, was it part of your job as head writer to select some of the staff writers? And if so, what qualities did you look for in them?
Most of the time it was my job. It sort of depends where the show was. One time the show had come from a very productive sitcom company called Miller Boyett. And they had multiple shows and lots of writers already. And they had written, Miller and Boyett hadn't, Bill Bickley and Michael Warren had written a pilot, and I was hired to come run the show because they couldn't run all these shows themselves. They had already staffed the show. I knew many of the writers, but that time I was the last person hired. Other times I took over a show that was already in progress, another Miller Boyett show called Step by Step. I came in to run the show in the second year. So much of the staff was in place. And in fact, half of it had been writers that I had worked with on the other Miller Boyett show, so I knew them and thought highly of them. But there were a couple of slots I needed to fill. In other cases, especially when it was a new show where I had written the pilot and the show was going into its first season, it's a blank slate, and I had to put together a writing staff from scratch there. People I knew, sometimes people I had not worked with before. I always tried to make sure we had somewhat of a balance gender-wise, especially on family sitcoms where we were going to be writing about male points of view and female points of view, and I did not think it was a good idea to just have men writing what teenage girls think and so on. So I've done sort of all those variations of hiring the staff. And when you ask what qualities you look for, I want to make sure that I think they're good writers. So what does that mean? That they put character writing ahead of the joke, per se. That they don't just pitch wild jokes, but that they're telling a story. They're telling a real story. I thought that was incredibly important on family sitcoms because they're so rooted in that basic storyline that you're telling about those almost tribal experiences that we've all gone through about getting your first bra or your driver's license or all those kind of rites of passage that kids and families go through. I also want them to, especially when I was working on what was called TGIF, the ABC's Family Friday kid and family friendly shows there. Some writers who had worked on very high profile shows did not think very highly of those shows, the ABC Kid and Family shows, and yet some of them would interview for a job because they needed a job, and I needed to make sure that they had a good attitude about being on the show that you're on, because if you just think, I'll be there for the paycheck, but this show's terrible, I don't think you're a very happy member of a team then. So I tried to avoid that situation, and largely did.
How would you see that in someone? That's interesting.
Well, I'll give you a specific example. I had a writer who had actually worked at Miller Boyett before, and and he's a really nice guy, but he was saying to me, I don't want to have to take notes from Miller and Boyett, and I just had to say to him, they own the company. I can't tell you you're not going to take notes from these guys. It's their candy store, and so we're here working for them. This is not a job for you. And we parted friends, and he went off and found other shows to work on there. But that would have been a bad situation. He wouldn't have been happy, and then I wouldn't have been happy because I would have been having this person. In his case, I was looking for a second in command person. I need that person to really be happy coming to work and not be unhappy.
Ross, I don't have children, but from the parents that I do talk to that have college-age kids, a lot of the children of this sort of generation, the millennials, some of them, feel that what's the use? Similar to the flower children of the 60s, like why fight against this system that they've seen maybe fail their parents in some sense? Why even bother to get a job and have student loan debt? What would you tell someone? Let's suppose there's a very creative youth, maybe a little defiant, that feels like they want to change the world, they want to tell stories, but hey, I don't want to have to do it this way. I don't want to have to go through the system, and I'm just going to go out there and I'll be the next Robert Rodriguez and I'll be fine.
I think you can be fine. I don't think you have to go to film school to be a filmmaker. I didn't go to film school. I would venture to say that most people in the film business did not go to film school. They followed a variety of paths in their lives. That said, I also think there is value to the college experience. I think it's a time when you mature as a person. But if you really don't want to go to college when you're 18, don't. Go get a job and then see what that life is like, and you'll have those experiences, and maybe you'll be better off going to college down the line, or maybe you won't find college fits with your life at all. I think there are a lot of choices on ways to go there. But and I almost go the other way. And I teach at a university, and it's a private university, and it's expensive and so on. And sometimes I find myself saying there's so much competition to get into a specific school. I have to go to this place. You see it not just in film school, but my son has to go to Yale, or a kid thinks I have to go to Berkeley or Stanford or something like that. And sometimes I think they take on so much debt to go to particular private schools that it may not be the right move for them there. And I think there are a lot of paths to success. And certainly Stephen Jobs found a non-college path to success for himself there, or he went for a short while to a school and got some things out of it there. I mean, in the book about him, and he's talked about this in interviews, his favorite class in college was calligraphy. And it really influenced him in choosing fonts when they developed the Macintosh computer. And so you get all kinds of things out of college that you don't necessarily perceive at the time as vocational training. And I'm a big advocate for people who want to be storytellers to read, whether you do that through college and taking other courses or just on your own. That's important, but you do not have to go to film school to get into the film business. And you do not have to go to college to be successful. There are certain jobs where you do need a college degree. If you want to try and get into the Director's Guild training program, if you want to try and get into one of the studio training programs, they're going to require a college degree. But there are many, many paths to success.
Well, let's say suppose someone does want to go to college, then maybe that opportunity isn't waiting for them, but they want to make films. What's just, get a DSLR camera, start uploading content to YouTube? What are some of the things that you tell people that they can do, and also some DIY tips that they can do?
Yeah, I think those things are all possible there, but, and I give this tip to my students as well as to non-students there. If you're looking for the highest percentage way to try and find work in the film industry, learn how to edit or learn how to do post-production sound, because there's such a huge need for people to be skilled at those tasks. And everybody wants to be the director or the writer, but if you can have a real bona fide skill, and it's not just a button pushing job, they are genuinely creative jobs, people who are sound designers and people who are editors, you're going to find entry level work. They're not going to hire you to be the editor on the next Hobbit film or something like that, but there's so much production of web series, of reality shows, of everything you can imagine, industrial films and so on, that they need skilled, competent editors, that you can find a way to pay the bills and be learning more and more about your craft every day. We had a student who was an excellent editor at Chapman some years ago, who did not get her ideal job coming right out of school. She, as she so elegantly described it, spent a year blurring out boobs and balls for some sort of reality show. But then, because she was getting better and better at it, she became the assistant editor on CSI, on the Las Vegas CSI series, and did that for 3 or 4 seasons, and now is a bona fide working professional and so on. And it's because she had a genuine skill that she could vend out there in the world.
Should it be a film school graduate's priority to get into feature filmmaking, or would they be better off pursuing, shorter content on the web?
I get asked this question all the time, what's the best first job for me when I get out of film school? And I think the answer is whatever job you end up getting, because your second job will be 100 times easier to get than your first job. When you're getting your first job, you don't have credits. And the students put together these resumes that have all the student films they worked on listed on it, and nobody in the professional world cares about that, and they don't care what your GPA was or whether you received the Chancellor's Award for X or anything. They want to know what you can do, and they can only find that out when you start working and start showing what you can do. Look, if you're determined to work in feature films, you'll get there eventually. I think there are many advantages to not working in feature films depending on what your chosen job path is. Let's say you want to be a cinematographer. Well, the traditional way to do this in the old days was you'd get a job at an equipment rental company, and you'd be the person who would check out the gear to the companies who were renting it, and then maybe you'd get a job as a second camera assistant and then a first camera assistant and so on. Perfectly good path and works there. But if you get out of film school and you really want to start shooting things yourself, then doing web series might be a better option for you, because no one's going to hire you. Forget shooting Lord of the Rings. No one's going to hire you to shoot an episode of Hawaii Five-0 or even a reality show there. But somebody might hire you to be the DP, the director of photography on a web series, and that might suit you better. And then you can find ways to work on slightly larger projects and build your reel and all of that. There's just lots of ways to get to the end point in the business. I also think it's important to not just get locked in on, no, I only want to do this. I've had people say to me, I want to be a director, so I'm not going to take a job as an assistant director because then I'll get typecast as an assistant director. And my response is, as opposed to being typecast as a barista, I mean, you've got to pay the bills somehow. Wouldn't it be better to have a job in the industry, learning about the industry, watching the director, seeing how different directors work, how sets operate, than just saying, no, I will only step in when I am the visionary? I don't understand that attitude.
Right. Well, how much of an eye-opener is that when you have actually talked to a student about that? I mean, are you able to change their minds?
I would say 3/4 of the time I can change their minds. We had a student, this is an interesting example from a couple years ago. Her goal was to be in the sports broadcasting part of the business. And she was about to graduate, and she'd been offered a job at the NFL network. And she was waffling about whether to take this job. I said, what on earth could be preventing you from saying this is the opportunity of a lifetime? She said, well, it's in LA and I don't really like LA. I'd rather be in San Diego. And they're only paying $17 an hour. And I just said to the student, you're out of your mind if you don't take this job. You want to work in San Diego? You're going to have a much better chance getting a job in San Diego when you've got the NFL network on your credit list. You can go to the Chargers then and you have a bona fide resume there. And I actually went to her friends after she left the classroom and said, you've got to talk to her. You cannot let her turn this job down. And she took the job and then emailed me a couple months later and said, yeah, you were right.
Oh, great.
So usually when you're being reasonable, you can succeed with the students. And sometimes they don't choose to do it and they just may not have what it takes personality-wise to pursue this path. And that's fine too. Maybe they're meant to do something else in life.
Well, that's interesting because what is your advice to graduating film students, not just creatively, but also in a commonsensical way or emotionally, or I mean, because I think we all have these grand expectations about getting out there in the real world. And I think it's interesting when you said, tell that one 18-year-old that can't go to college, how about getting a job? I mean, that'll definitely teach you all sorts of things about life, timing, schedules, people.
Yeah, you know, I give the students varying advice. One of the things I do through my job as a professor is I'm the advisor, faculty advisor for the TV club. And we bring in speakers who are very successful most of the time. But in the late spring, I do an event called Foot in the Door Night, where I bring in the alums who are 1 to 5 years into the business and say, tell them what you know now that you wish you'd knew when you were in film school. Tell them how do they go about getting their first job? Because I can talk about how I got my first job a billion years ago, but it's better for the recent people to be there. So not just for this event, but in general, I try and get the graduating students to talk to the people who are a year or two ahead of them and hear firsthand, what's it like out there? What do I need to be doing? What should I be doing? I also always have found this true for my life, and I think it's still true. The way I put it is, if people are paying me for $5 worth of work, I try and give them $10 worth of work. And you know, I try to see it as an opportunity. And sometimes I get students who are more about, well, they're abusing me and they're asking me to do too much. And it's, you know, yeah, that's the time-honored tradition of people entering every business. With, you know, again, it doesn't matter whether it's the carpet business or the entertainment industry, you pay your dues. And if you really love the business, you should enjoy the paying the dues part. Yeah, there's some stuff that nobody likes having to clean out the kitchen or the bathroom or whatever low-level job you do. But again, just like at another time you asked, how do you deal with the challenges of the writing room if you're a lower-level writer? I think if you're a PA, you should be saying, I landed a job in Hollywood and there are 8 million people who want this job, and this is going to make a great story someday. It's, you know, the day that they made you stand in for a dog, the day that you had to do the impossible thing. There's a wonderful book called The Mailroom that's about all the people who had to start out in the mailroom at the big talent agencies at William Morris and ICM and so on, and how they succeeded. And, you know, some of them had to do some pretty gnarly things take people's urine or stool samples to the doctor for them, things like that. I heard one story of a PA, not at an agency, but on a sitcom, who the producers came to the PA and said, we have a dog that was having problems biting people, so we had to send the dog to obedience school, and now we've gotten the dog back. Will you go to our house and let yourself into the yard and see if the dog attacks you? As the story goes, the PA said no, and they fired him.
Wow. Okay.
And I have this on pretty good authority, it's true there. So sometimes you do have to say no, but most of the time when they're not asking you to be a chew toy for dogs,
right.
If it's just, gee, that I have to get lunch order and somebody's mad at me because I got Swiss cheese instead of cheddar cheese, okay, you can deal with that. That's not the biggest problem in your life. Move on and look at the bigger picture, which is you're being given an opportunity to do something that you really want to do.
Ross, do you think it's harder for your graduating students to enter the workforce now? Do you think it's more competitive, or is that just my own perception being a generation or two behind these students?
I think it's always been competitive, and sometimes people use the word cutthroat there, but I've actually found that once you sort of get into the process of working there, once you get a job and so on, people are incredibly helpful if you've been a good worker. If you've done a good job, people are willing to help you find your next job there, or you build camaraderie amongst the people who do the same job that you do, that then you build this network of friends and colleagues, and you swap stories over coffee or beer or whatever when you're not working. But then it also turns into they get offered a job that they can't take because they're committed to something else, and they give that person your name. And so I've actually found that even though it's competitive, there's no mistaking it, it's incredibly competitive, that in terms of cutthroat, I haven't had too much of that experience there. I've mostly had people treat me fairly well.
So going back to the time when you were those 9 years, do you see a lot of parallels between what your students are going through, or I realize it's a different ballgame, people are shooting with DSLR cameras and the web content and all that stuff, but do you see it as pretty much the same, it's just a little bit of a different animal?
I think it's somewhat the same, but I also think that time gives a person a different perspective on it. I had a conversation with my students last year. I teach a course called The Business of Television, and it's how do the networks work with the studios, and where do agencies come in, and the unions, and just all the sort of the business model questions about the business. But at the end of the semester, I try to give them a sense of what their career path might be, and say, if you wanted to be a writer, here's what a good first job would be, because you're not going to be a writer right away. You may have to be a PA for the writing staff, and then a writer's assistant, and then maybe get a shot at being what's sometimes called the baby writer on the staff, and so on. And I went through this for different jobs, producer, studio executive, and then said, so what you're looking at to get to this goal that you have to be a director, or to be a head writer on a TV show, or to be a senior executive at a studio or a network, it's going to take you a good 15 to 20 years. And I thought they were going to throw the furniture at me. I thought they were 15 years? And so from their perspective, that was an outrageous amount of time. But from my perspective, I just looked at them and said, really? You think that having to wait until you're 36 to be in charge of a television show is an outrageously long amount of time? Do you know how much you have to learn to be able to do that job? How much just raw experience you need to see where things go right, they go wrong? How are you going to handle that situation? So it is about perspective. And I can see it with students on a smaller scale. I had a student who really wanted to be a studio executive, and she couldn't find there's a clear path for that, to be an assistant to a studio executive, and she couldn't find that job for about a year and a half. She had sort of piecemeal jobs there. But then she got a job as the assistant to the senior television executive, or one of the senior television executives at Warner Brothers Television. And now she's moved up to the next job where she's a junior executive herself now. So during that year and a half, when you're a college student or you're in your early 20s and you haven't broken through yet, it's agonizing. It seems like an interminable amount of time. But when you do break through, you can look back and say, it really wasn't that long. It was a year and a half. But I think the advice then for people who are aspiring is you're going to have to be both patient and persistent. that there are a lot of people knocking on the same door you're knocking on, and so you have to keep at it. And if they don't answer this door, try this door. If they don't say, all those cliches. If they don't open the door, go through the window, and all of those things. It takes time.
Ross, when you were trying to get into those writing rooms, when you were writing those script specs and those 9 years, how do you think that compared to your peers at that time? Were they going through the same struggles? Was it taking the same amount of time?
Yeah, for most of them, may not have literally taken 9 years, but one of my childhood friends is Joel Cerno, who co-created 24, and we were both aspiring writers. We had a radio show together, sketch comedy in college when we were freshmen or sophomores, I forget which, and then he transferred, went to UCLA, and we were both writing spec scripts in our early 20s, and he broke in the year before I did. He got his first staff writing job on a show called Bay City Blues, I think, which was produced by Stephen Bochco after Hill Street Blues. This was a baseball team show. And then the next year I got the Cosby Show myself. So, we both became successful in our own fields there, comedy and drama, but it took us a while to break in. And I think for both of us, it took us a while to get good enough. It's really, aspiring to be a writer and having the craft to be a writer, not just the talent, the basic talent, but the craft takes a while. I remember before I broke through and got an agent, I was working as an assistant director, and a very kind television director knew that I wanted to be a writer and asked to read my spec feature film that I wrote. And he did, and he said, I want to give this to an agent. And he gave it to an agent, and they reported back the following conversation. The agent said, I'm not going to represent him. And the director said, well, why not? And the agent said, he's not ready. And the director said, I understand that, but isn't it obvious that he's going to be ready in a couple years? And the agent actually said, yeah, and when he's ready, I'll represent him. But I'm not in the business of 2 years from now. I'm in the business of today. And so that's one of the challenges for you as a writer, that just having potential isn't enough. You have to be ready to compete, so to speak, on a professional level. You won't be as good as you will 10 years into your professional writing career, but you have to be ready to hit the ball back and forth over the net with the people you're going to have to play with.
And what are some of the signs that someone's actually ready, that it's not just potential and not just, blossoming talent?
Well, I think when you give your script to people who are in the business, and instead of sort of giving you general encouragement, they say something like, I want to give this to somebody, to an agent I know, or they say, what's the next step for you? I'm looking for an agent, I'm looking for a manager. Let me see if I can give this to some people. Because then that's validation. That's somebody who's a professional saying, I think this is professional level work. So I think that's a sign.
How do you develop a character over a course of a web series?
Well, this is, whether you're doing a traditional television series or a web series, developing the characters is something you have to work on. The adage is you're always in development on a series. It's not like you stop developing with the pilot. Each episode should develop it. I talk about this a little bit this is the plug part here, in my book,
Very nice.
Create Your Own TV Series for the Internet.
Beautiful.
And that's one of the things I discuss in the chapters on characters and developing your series. I think that's a question you should ask yourself when you're writing an episode 2, episode 3, episode 4 of your web series. How is this growing the series? What new aspect of the characters am I revealing here? What new aspect of the series am I revealing? Am I putting two characters together that I didn't pair together in the pilot and getting a new dynamic that way? I mean, that's something that I did in my sitcom writer-producer days all the time. You're doing a show. I was on a show called Step by Step that ran for 7 years. You got to keep making the show fresh somehow. In the case of a family sitcom, you have the luxury of the kids getting older every year, so the stories evolve that way. But I think if you're doing a web series and you're not growing your characters, you're not growing your series. And it's real easy for the audience to get tired of your show if it's sort of the same joke over and over and over again. And I think this is why some characters are great series characters and others are standalone. I think the example I give in my book is that the soup Nazi on Seinfeld is a great character for a couple of episodes, but you do not want to try and write the soup Nazi series, because it's the same joke over and over again. You, no soup for 2 weeks. Or you say, well, what about on a date? It's going to, you, no date for 2 weeks. It's the same. I don't know where you go with the soup Nazi. He's not as developed a character as Seinfeld or Kramer or Elaine or Andy or George.
Well, what can someone do to play around with this supposed main character to see if they have legs, so to speak?
Well, I think this is one of the things you should do while you're developing your series and you're developing your pilot story, is you should say, okay, what would future episodes be? You don't have to develop the whole story for it, but what other situations can I put this character or this set of characters in to get stories? Again, just like in the traditional television world, when you shoot a pilot for a network and they're going to evaluate it, you have to submit a half a dozen story ideas for future episodes to them so that they can get a sense of, is there a future for this show? And I think you as a creative person should do that for yourself and say, where can I go with these characters? And in trying to find those ideas, I think you can play the what if game. What if this happened? And that's a lot of where story ideas come from. That's a question I get asked, where do you get your ideas from? And I give an example of, I wrote family television shows, needed to write an adult spec script to show that I could write for adults. So I was going to write for Frasier. Didn't have an idea yet. I was just living my life. My wife is a therapist, and at that time she was a trainee. She had just gotten her graduate degree and was a trainee in an office of therapists, and the woman who ran the office, the head therapist there, had a Christmas party. So we went to the Christmas party, and at this woman's house. And this woman's area of specialization was she was a sex therapist. She was not a surrogate. She did not sleep with her clients, but she talked to people about sexual issues and problems. And I realized, I'm meeting her for the first time at her house, that I'm incredibly uncomfortable meeting her because I think she's judging how close I'm standing to my wife or whether I'm touching her enough, and she's evaluating our sex life that way. And I kind of laughed at myself and then said, actually, that's great for Frasier. Frasier's a therapist. What if he dated a sex therapist that he met at a professional conference? And so, that was, in a way, that's still connected back to developing your series or your web series. What if this happened? How would that would be a new situation? Obviously, you're going to use the characters you have. They don't radically change on a television series or a web series, but they have to grow in increments. So how does this story grow your character by some increment? Show us a different side of that character that we have not seen before.
So many of us have these wonderful ideas and, oh wow, that's so funny, you should put that line in a movie. But you just said to us off camera, which sparked this great question, that sometimes it's a gentle nudge when something is really great for a script and sometimes it's not.
Yeah, I think part of the trick is knowing when the idea has entered your brain, and rather than just thinking, oh, well, that's a funny situation that happened, or that's an interesting situation, and not connecting it to, hey, wait a minute, I can write about that. I wrote a play about my parents and my parents' toxic marriage and divorce and a fairly dark time in my life, and the play was going to have 2 stage readings at the Pasadena Playhouse with a well-known actress playing my mother at the reading, and I was very excited about this. And I hadn't talked to my mother in many years at that point in time. And I was walking around really in a sunny mood about, wow, this great actress is going to be reading my words in my play in front of an audience, and I was so excited. And then I had this waking nightmare that my mother was going to show up at the reading and jump up on stage and say, that's not true, that's a lie, you have to hear my side of the story. And I just sort of laughed at myself for being paranoid. But then it occurred to me, I went, hey, wait a minute, that's a good idea for a play, someone who's been writing about their family and their family descends upon them. And it's not a fully formed idea. You have to then do your work as a writer and say, okay, so who are these people? Why haven't they talked to each other? What happens when the person comes up on stage? How does the situation get more complex, then more complicated, or funnier, or any of those things? Who are the other people involved? All of that work. That's the job of being a writer, of taking a germ of an idea and trying to grow it into a full-blown piece, whatever that piece is, if it's a web series or a play. But I think you have to develop the skill of being tuned in to your thoughts and feelings, the world around you when you're watching other people, in order to know when an idea presents itself. The idea doesn't always say, hello, I'm giving you an idea for a story now. That's part of being a writer, recognizing when the idea has presented itself.
Or something as just hilarious as the soup Nazi just hits you over the head. Yes, that's funny, but can we really base an entire show off of it and a long-standing character?
Right, yeah, I think knowing the difference between an idea that can sustain a sketch and an idea that can sustain a 2-hour movie, or a character that's good for a couple of scenes in a couple of episodes versus a character that you can base a series around, I think those are all judgment calls that you have to make as a writer and as a series creator. That, you know, as funny as the soup Nazi was on Seinfeld, and I adore the soup Nazi character, I would not want to do the soup Nazi series. And there's a reason why they have not done the soup Nazi series, because it's the same joke over and over again. You know, no soup, 2 weeks for you. And you can't build a series around that. You need more complexity. You see this a lot of the time when they try and take sketches that have been very funny on Saturday Night Live and turn them into feature films, and you just say this was a very bad idea. And even with, you know, really good material, not all material is as good in one form as it is in another form. You've seen plays that have been fantastic plays turned into it didn't quite work movies and things like that.
Right.
So, and then there are pieces of material that work across all kinds of genres. The Odd Couple, success as a stage play, a success as a feature film, a success as a television series. So. And I think they're actually trying it again as we speak, that Matthew Perry's doing a new version of The Odd Couple pilot this season.
Well, what are some of the tips then? Because it sounds like it's intuition that's really guiding someone, or are there some things you can work out on paper?
Well, I think there are certain guidelines that you need some experience to say, does this character have depth, or is this character one-dimensional? If the character is one-dimensional, which is the soup Nazi, you know, and that's why we've only seen him in that one dimension. He's at the soup place and other people are interacting with him. You can't build a series around it. I do think it takes some experience, and again, I think it takes some missteps sometimes as a writer, that you think, oh, this is a great idea, and you write it and realize, yeah, there's not enough to this idea yet, or I haven't developed this idea enough to get a full series out of this idea. That's some of the experience my students at Chapman have when I teach the webisode class there. They each write a pilot for a 3 to 5 minute web series pilot. I pick 2, we shoot the pilots, edit them, and then make, in the second semester, write, shoot, and edit 3 more episodes of each show. And sometimes there's great enthusiasm for what seemed the funniest script, and we go and we shoot that, and then there just don't seem to be enough ideas that come out of it. And so by the 3rd or 4th episode, we're really struggling trying to come up with an idea.